Hi and welcome to another episode of The Leadership Enigma. Well, the world continues to go slightly mad. And we're talking now all the time to leaders about three arenas really. The changing landscape of our leadership in context of the organization that we work and live within, and also our own self-development and personal leadership. Now, a term that you'll hear a lot is high performance, but what does high performance mean? In fact, we are all work in progress and we are all on a journey to high performance. So I need someone, you know what I say, always wiser than me, that can help me in some ways unravel that question. What is high performance? You do not want to miss this episode. Come back to me where we'll speak to Dan Lewindon, who is indeed at the moment the head of performance, or high performance, I should say. Let me just start again. So Dan is the head of, I'm getting mad here now. I've got it written here. High performance, yes. Come back to me after this because Dan is the head of high performance science and medicine at the LTA. Now, if you're passionate about tennis like I am, you also want to hear that story too. Come back to me just after this.
You're listening to The Leadership Enigma, powered by Transform Performance International, a podcast for the insatiably curious to explore the power of human-centered leadership to create real momentum for positive and sustainable change. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts, and disruptors as we discover that success leaves clues. Now, here's your host, Adam Pacifico.
Is your host, Adam Pacifico.
Hey Dan, it's a big warm welcome for the Leadership Enigma. Thanks very much for taking the time to chat to us.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be here.
Now, after that introduction, I'm going to really pass the baton to you, no pun intended, because tell us a little bit about your journey, because I know you've got a medical or physio background before you came into this particular role. So tell us a little about your journey before you got to the LTA.
Sure. So I guess my journey, I've been involved in sports now for about 20 years or so. I'm a physiotherapist by trade, so I started off, as many people do, working within the NHS. I was then really fortunate to start working within Premiership Rugby at Northampton Saints for 6 or 7 years through some highs and lows. And during that time, obviously evolved from a starting physiotherapist into the lead physiotherapist. Then in 2009, I was approached by England Rugby to work as a physiotherapist for the senior team, and was hugely fortunate to work for them again for 7 years or so through some very big highs and lows. And then in 2016, I was approached by the LTA, which is the governing body of tennis in the UK, about the role which I'm now in, which is head of performance science and medicine. So I guess my journey in a nutshell has been developing skills as a technical expert, as a physiotherapist, working within high performance sport, to now a role which ultimately sees me lead and manage 25, 30 staff across different disciplines within healthcare, doctors, physiotherapists, strength coaches, nutritionists, analysts, psychologists, you name it. That's my role now.
No, that's great. Now, I know we're going to talk about high performance, certainly in the context of the sporting arena where you spend a lot of your working life, but also we're going to bring that across, aren't we, to leaders and leadership. So if you went into sport, would you say you went into the professional rugby arena for England Rugby? And as you say, there are extreme highs and extreme lows, aren't there, in that kind of environment? What impact does that have on just generally people's performance when the highs and lows are so extreme? It's a real roller coaster, and we see that play out on television all the time. But how does that impact generally on people's attitude to performance per se?
Oh, I think it's incredible to be involved in. So I think you are living and breathing the environment of the athletes and ultimately their performances week on week and month on month. So it's brilliant to be part of. I mean, I was really lucky within England Rugby to join a really established support team of doctors, strength coaches, and analysts, etc. And as a result, inherently and quite quickly, we developed a very strong integrated bond in the way that we worked together, supported each other through challenges and, successes as well. And, obviously you celebrate your successes and you reflect on your and your losses, don't you? And I think I guess that was one of the catalysts to me of wanting to move into a leadership space, was ultimately seeing how a really high functioning team can operate and can support each other emotionally and professionally during difficult times. Come around, I guess, what we would call performance problems in terms of supporting our athletes and our teams to perform at their best. But ultimately, I guess, become more than the sum of our parts. And that's always what's really interested me in this kind of space.
Now, you just used a phrase that I was about to use. I would say great minds think alike. You talked about some of the parts. So when we talk about high performance, and we're talking about high performance now within a sporting context, and perhaps we're still with your work within England Rugby, there were lots of you who were technically... There were lots of you who were... That's all right. So there were lots of you who were technically... Can you hear me all right, Dan?
Yeah, I lost that, mate. You have to go back to where you said time at England Rugby. I'm sorry.
No problems at all. No problems at all. It's easy for that. That will just disappear. So when we talk about specifically maybe your time at England Rugby, there were lots of you who were experts in your field. So you were coming in from the physio perspective. Someone may have come in from a nutrition perspective. Others may have come in from a medical perspective as the doctor, and so many more. So how do the sum of the parts operate in order to create a culture of high performance for the athletes that you're working with?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess if I rewind slightly before I answer that, I guess when I started in professional rugby, I believe there was 2 physiotherapists, of which I was one, and 1 strength coach, and we were the sum of the team. And now, as you say, 15, 20 years on, it's not unrealistic to have 15, potentially different disciplines operating together, hopefully in harmony within that kind of team context or around that individual. It's not easy. The amount of technical expertise you now have in different domains, be it nutrition or analysis or psychology, is really, really significant. But I guess the risk of what comes with that, which you can see, is the potential for noise, where if you're working within your own silo and space with expertise, you can be adding noise to the system of that player or that team without the context of all the other areas. And I think that the real skill for me comes in not only the relationship that those people have and how they operate around each other, in terms of their own levels of humility and curiosity, and ability to share and be open around what they're trying to achieve. But equally, it's having a really clear idea of what you're trying to do. So I think if you take any athlete at any point, there's always a bunch of stuff you can do to make them more psychologically resilient, more robust physically, eat better foods, not stay up all night watching Netflix, whatever it is. I think the reality is it's honing in and lasering in on what's the big ticket things that are going to make the biggest difference to how they perform in their arena. So within rugby, that's on the field of play. It might be, can they tolerate the intensity and volume of training that the coaches need for them to practice the patterns of play. On the field, it might be they can sustain that level of work at an international level to beat the All Blacks or to beat South Africa. And I think once you've got a really clear understanding of, at an individual level, what's going to make the difference here to this player, be it a fly half or a scrum half, and you've got a strong understanding of the demands of the sport, you can start to circle wagons around how each of those disciplines can operate in an integrated manner to address those big problems. And inevitably, I think working in sport, you do have lots of generalists, people who have a broad understanding of not only their area of expertise, but other areas. And there's a lot of diversity of thinking, which is brilliant if it's harnessed in the right way. So I think it comes back to me for having the right personality set of people and the environment in which they work, but equally having a really, really clear sense of what's going to make the difference.
Now, this is fascinating because I'm changing tack ever so slightly. So many leaders have got to a position within their organization, have relied on their technical ability, their technical competence, perhaps a gifted lawyer in a field, a gifted accountant or an engineer, whatever it might be. And as they move into a position of leadership, there is less reliance on the technical gifts they have and experience, which has served them so well, and perhaps more reliance on something you've mentioned, the human-centered leadership piece. Now their ability to be curious and empathetic and in some ways vulnerable and to be utterly inclusive. And sometimes that's a really hard path for leaders to tread, to not rely on something that has stood them in good stead for many decades. And in order to get the benefit of the sum of the parts, focus on the human-centered leadership capabilities. Now, I know you've experienced that too, because you are an expert in your field. But as you say, with so many, maybe 15 or more incredible experts together, it's how do you get that sum of the parts together? What are the human-centered capabilities for you that created that high-performance culture?
Yeah, so I guess I'm going to talk about that in terms of my own journey, good and bad within that leadership space, I guess. But I guess if I rewind to that moment in time, which I'm always going to look at with relatively rose-tinted glasses because it was something that happened previously.
Yeah.
There wasn't necessarily a pinnacle of that group. There wasn't necessarily a main point of contact from a performance support perspective. We had a head coach, and at the time that I left, it was Eddie Jones,
yep.
Who ultimately is the performance director of that team and that support structure. But in terms of the way that the support operated around that, there wasn't necessarily a kind of pinnacle at the top of that. It was very much based on the relationships and mutual respect that people had for each other. And also, I guess, the commitment to what you're trying to achieve collectively on the field with that group, which is obviously hugely powerful within the team sport. So
yep.
It didn't necessarily need a head of the snake, I don't think, during that period of time. Fast forwarding now, I guess, into my current space where I operate as that kind of lead role, I guess I'm always happy to say that these conversations are really cathartic because you start to talk about all the things that you've done wrong, of which I've done a huge number.
We're work in progress, aren't we, Dan?
That's the thing. I was going to say, I'm by no means a finished article talking to you today, but I guess there are certain characteristics that really help, which you mentioned, around being curious, being empathetic, being, I guess, having a good sense of humility within that space as well. But in reality, you are taking off one coat and putting another one on. So when you walk into that space, what gets you perhaps in the door is that you're a technical expert and you've got some credibility and a reputation with which to walk into a leadership space.
Yeah.
But quite quickly, that means absolutely nothing, because that small, within my case anyway, without that small area of technical expertise, all the other domains you are not a technical expert in. And very, very quickly, you if you're going to be successful at all, you need to demonstrate that you don't have all the answers. And one of the again, we'll go through lots of things I've learned, I'm sure, today, but one of the things I've definitely learned is that when it comes to making decisions, when I arrived in the role I'm now very fortunate to have, I fell into the trap of always looking to make a decision to be seen as the lead,
right.
to be seen as the lead.
Oh, hang on. You have to go backwards, Dan. I've lost your sound. Hang on. Just go back 10 seconds.
Sure. What was I saying before? So saying, oh yes, okay. So if we go back to outwith of your area of technical expertise, which I had,
yes.
Everything else you're not a domain expert in. So very, very, very quickly, you need to understand and value being humble and having a healthy dose of humility in that space. And I think one of the traps I fell into early on, which I'm happy to talk about, was seeing myself as a leader in that space, being made me mean like being a leader in that space made me feel like I needed to be very decisive. So I need to be the one who's seen to make those big decisions.
Did you feel like you had to solve all the problems as well, Dan? Did you feel like it was on you? Right.
Yeah, very much. That's your identity that you've given yourself. You're wearing this patch of leader, and as a result, you need to be the one that's solving these very complex problems. And what I've learned, to my cost, but also to my benefit over time, is to not only slow down decision making, particularly in complex situations, of which where I work now there are many, but also to draw on the expertise I have openly, and also not always be the decision maker, because when it comes to, I guess, the believability and depth of context that I have compared to the group that I ultimately manage, sometimes I'm not best placed to have the most credible answer.
Yeah.
And that takes it's taken me a lot of reflection, self-development to get to that point, I guess, where I'm comfortable to do that.
So, there's the humility in itself, is that, as you say, you're now leading a group of people in a high performance and sometimes I would have thought stressful environment, take into account the stakes if we're talking about people competing at the highest level now on the tennis court. What have you learned in relation to leveraging that diversity of thought? Because as you said, if you are just the problem solver, then it's all on you and you must come up with the answers. But when you're in a high performance environment with so many experts and so many people who have wisdom, how do you leverage that diversity of thought? Because so many of the challenges that we now have to deal with are very diverse in nature because we're in a world that constantly changes. So how do you now in your role leverage the collective and get that diversity of thought out of that team of 25? Because I assume in sporting, we hear the term marginal gains, don't we? If we're talking about, I don't know, what turns someone into 50th in the world as a tennis player into 9 in the world as a tennis player, maybe it's very modest, the change that needs to take place for them to shoot up the rankings. I think we probably all saw, didn't we, with Emma Raducanu, who what she did from, I think she was ranked 150 and then won the US Open. Something shifted, something changed. But how do you leverage that diversity of thought of your team to create those gains and performance wins in the athletes now that you work with?
Sure. So I guess a number of things I need to say to that. I guess ultimately the remit of my team within performance support, which is ultimately sports science and medicine, is to operate to a certain degree all the way down the pathways, as we kind of chatted before we started, all the way up with some light touch at the elite end. So we operate across quite a diverse range of demographics, age-wise, gender-wise, performance-wise.
Let's just give people an overview of that, Dan, whilst you're talking about it, because I love the fact that you're actually working with the young kids who are coming through as well. So just help the listeners understand what are the various groups that you actually now are assisting from a performance point of view.
So I guess if we think about the pathway in the British system now, the pathway starts very young. I mean, tennis is an early adoption sport. There's no doubt about that. And I guess from an LTA perspective, we provide some level of support, oversight, education, and guidance from as early as 10 years of age, all the way through, as you'll have seen, to more established players playing in our elite competitions like Davis Cup or Billie Jean King Cup and some of our established players. I guess what support we provide evolves gradually and changes quite significantly. So at a much younger end of the pathway, it's about exploring the sport. Ultimately, it's about building foundations. It's about making sure that end of the pathway has the right education, resources, and support for its system to allow its players to flourish. As those players get older and older and they kind of transition into this emerging professional space, our support intensifies inevitably in terms of making sure that they are at an individual level as robust as they can be, as physically strong as they can be to support their tennis aspirations.
Yeah, it's not just about the tennis, is it, Dan? Not just about the tennis, is it?
No, it's definitely not. I mean, I guess when we think about the rigors of being a professional tennis player, playing week on week globally, and oftentimes, particularly when you're an emerging player, you're traveling often with yourself or just with a coach. It can be a very challenging environment to be in. So I think when we think about the well-being development of young people, when we think about their physical robustness to be able to tolerate playing 30 weeks on tour, traveling with high frequency, playing 2 to 3 matches a week every week, you pay quite a physical cost, so they need to be ready for it. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. But I guess as you get into that space, we start to intensify how we work. We become more specific, as I mentioned earlier, in the rugby space around what's going to make the biggest difference to this player. And obviously, inevitably, the quality of the coaches that they have and the coaching that we provide through the LTA is very, very high. And that will always be the most important thing. But then our role, as it describes, is to support that performance and look at how building greatest areas of strength, power, movement, psychological resilience can supplement and enhance their ability to play tennis better. So it kind of intensifies up in that scholarship or emerging professional stage.
Yes.
And that's where I guess we have more individual contact with our players.
So there's a holistic approach, isn't there, really? Because as you say, we come back to the sum of the parts. Being gifted on the tennis court or the rugby field or the football pitch or whatever it might be, yes, is absolutely necessary to have that innate capability. But then there's this incredibly solid foundation that's required. which in some ways you're having to look after more of a holistic approach to the abilities of the athlete to compete and actually be well in themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, I must say, my experiences in rugby, which again was a different system, different environment, different world really compared to tennis. Back in the day, and I'm now talking back 6 years or so,
yeah,
the kind of the well-being management attributed to English rugby or England rugby players at that point was emergent at best. There wasn't necessarily a focus around how we were safeguarding their well-being as much as there is now, because it's much more in public consciousness. There's a much greater awareness of how it can not only make for better players but also better people. And I think it's something in my time at the LTA that has only grown and grown, and it definitely acts now, I think, as a pillar of how we develop young people and how we support people that are working with them to understand them best and to help them to develop at the right rate.
I mean, the fact that you're working with young adults, as you say, within the LTA in some ways enhances that level of importance. Has there been a difference for you? It's just popped into my mind, Dan. Has there been a difference for you working with England Rugby in a team environment where you've got a squad to maybe working within the LTA where you've got a lot of individually brilliant players who are seeking to be the next best tennis player maybe in the world, but that's a really lonely battle.
It is, and they are completely different worlds. And again, another trap I fell into was almost trying to blueprint my experiences from rugby and what was successful and what good looks like in terms of performance support context, and lift that and put that into tennis. And they're very different. They're very, very different animals. I think there are some positives and negatives to both. So I think if you think about a rugby context, although you're in front of 100,000 people and on TV in front of a few million, you're there with 15 of ultimately your best friends, trying to work collectively to win a match. And there's quite a lot of solidarity on field that comes with that. If you transpose that into a tennis environment, you walk out onto court completely on your own, again observed by millions, scrutinized by them as well. And the amount of, I guess, self-resilience and assuredness that you have to have is pretty significant, particularly when it's a sport that no matter how good you are, you're going to lose more than you win. And your ability to kind of contextualize that and remain confident and on course, it takes a lot of kind of, I guess, self-reliance.
Now, I'm fascinated by this area, so I'm going to stop and we're going to pause if we can. I'm passionate about tennis. I ache even after one match now. But talk to me a little bit about mindset, because there's something about what's the mindset of a squad of 15, as you say, on a pitch in front of 100,000 and millions of people, in their ability to overcome, stay resilient, rise to the challenge. And then one person, as you say, maybe on a centre court, again in front of millions, and no one to help them, no coach allowed to go anywhere near them, and the feeling of isolation. Tell me a little bit of what you've learned from a mindset perspective working in those two very disparate camps.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to undersell the rugby, because I guess the stakes are very high, and those guys are under an enormous amount of pressure, and they cope with that extremely well. But I guess, like you say, that there is something to say for, in a gladiatorial sense, ultimately stepping out on your own against an opponent who wants to beat you in front of lots of people with very little support structure around you. And I guess ultimately, as not a psychologist, my technical kind of understanding of space is going to be limited. But what I would say is that from my observations, when you see a player playing tennis, between points, between games, in rest period, they are looking to their support in the crowd, and they are drawing energy from it. And whether that's the coach giving them the kind of positive look, or the S&C coach doing the same, or the cluster of their friends that have come to see them, they draw a huge amount of confidence and energy from that, in the good moments and the bad moments. We also have a team competition called the Davis Cup, which is a kind of, I guess, a British representative team, men's team, and same in the women's team as well. And the role that the captain plays in sitting, I guess, next to the referee, watching every point, living every moment, giving that player feedback, you can see the value that the player gets from having that human contact during.
Well, they can be coached, can't they, during in between games, can't they? Or there is that human proximity, whereas that's not allowed on the tour.
No, not currently allowed on the tour. And I guess whether it's the technical coaching or whether it's just the human element of someone being in it with you,
Yeah.
I do think it makes a difference. And I guess that's something that I've definitely observed, which helps. But it's bloody lonely, yeah, no doubt.
No, it's brutal. You know, I've kind of grown up around tennis most of my life, and I know anyone who's gone and tried to make it somewhere somehow on the tour has said it's incredibly lonely, and the mindset, the mental resilience needed when you say you're on that one-on-one gladiatorial battle, and there are many sports, aren't there, that have this, is extraordinary. Has to be extraordinary, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Let me just transpose some of this now into a leadership environment. So what are some of the kind of the big lessons that you carry with you now as a leader working in a high performing environment? I know you've mentioned a few, but what are those kind of front of mind lessons that you've learned and you carry with you all the time now with the experiences that you've had?
Sure. So I guess we've talked about a couple. I guess I'm going to talk about some of the mistakes wound into those learnings as well. So I guess one of the mistakes that I definitely made, and I've talked about this quite widely, is that I came into the sport from rugby with a preconceived notion of what high performance looked like.
Right.
And I guess I, at the time, inherited a team who, without a clear strategy. So at an organizational level within performance, we didn't really have a clear strategy when I joined the LT, and that's something that we had to work very hard at.
Yeah.
And within the team I inherited, there were some people that had been there for 10 plus years. There were some people who hadn't been there very long. They hadn't really had clear leadership or structure or a direction of travel. So they were kind of rudderless, I guess, through no fault of their own. And one of the mistakes I made, I guess, was to do what everyone does, which is to go in and observe and look at kind of where you feel you can add value and start to put the framework of a strategy together. But in playing that back to my team, one of the mistakes I made, and I've made more than once, is I moved too quick. So I moved from where we were to where I wanted us to be.
Right.
I didn't necessarily have everyone on board and on the bus in the way they needed to be, or engaged with the level that I should have done. So it became my plan rather than our plan.
Okay.
And again, when you're trying to get early buy-in as a leader, particularly when you are evolving and developing strategy, unless you've got that collective pull together, you're running into trouble straight away. I guess I had to go through quite a large change management process joining the organization as well, in terms of looking at the skill sets that people we had, the structure, the org chart that we had, and looking to evolve that so it would deliver against our kind of key deliverables. And I think that in some regards, I needed to go through that first before then going too far down through the road of strategy. So that's something that I learned. And I think, as I say, that my performance director at the time was a guy called Simon Timpson, who now works for Manchester City. Really great guy. We came on board really together. And one of the things he always said to me was, obviously you can move at speed, but if you look behind you and there's no one with you, you're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And I think understanding pace of change and understanding, making sure that the right stakeholders from an influencing perspective, both within my own ecosystem, but across the organization, making sure they're all with you is crucial. Otherwise, you're just paddling against the tide constantly. And that's so I've had to drastically reduce or change the pace at which I want to introduce change. And that's a lesson I've learned. But if you do that really well, you can actually move more quickly because, as I say, you're making more small steps together.
Gotcha. Dan, I want to actually link this to the podcast that is released just before you, where I chatted to Peter Searcy, who's been a people leader for years now at the FBI. And he talks about the difficulty in leading change where you have many type A personalities. You can imagine some of the personalities within law enforcement. Let me kind of transpose that onto the environment of, let's just take England Rugby. You must have lots of type A personalities and lots of people who are incredibly good at what they do. And I don't just mean the people on the field. So how or what have you learned in relation to, you talk about bringing people with you. How do you influence and get those types of personalities on board with you so they are in the rear view mirror when you look behind you and not somewhere over the horizon?
Yeah, and if I knew that answer really well, then I'd be doing a lot better than I am. I think
we'd both be writing a book.
We would, yeah, we would. I guess the way that I'd answer that is ultimately what I've learned is that to have influence, you have to get in sync. So whether it's a direct report that you're ultimately leading and managing, to a peer that works cross-functionally in a different department but is directly involved in your space, you have to take the time to build a personal relationship and get in sync and understand the world through their eyes, because inevitably we all have, as we all know, our own perception of reality and what, in high performance terms, this is high performance to me. This is what it looks like and feels like, and this is what I want to create. But that doesn't necessarily, one, transpose into the environment you're now in, or two, reflect the experiences and perspectives of the other people that you have. And I think there's, again, something I've learned as well is that you have to have that genuine curiosity and respect to get under the hood of what other people are seeing. And I think within that, again, it sounds wishy-washy, but taking that time to build those relationships, understanding their perspectives, you can quite quickly arrive at what the outcomes you both share. So what's the outcome we both share in this example that would take us on to the next step? And as a result, let's focus on that rather than on the differences we have around our experiences or what, how we're going to arrive at that destination. So I think that's worked for me.
Right.
I guess I'm really lucky that the team I directly lead, which are kind of the leadership group of lead physiotherapists, lead doctor, lead S&C, etc. They're all very established technical experts. There's a real blend of type A but non-type A personalities that I've managed to recruit, and therefore there's a really good blend. There's some awkward conversations with people who are quite similar in personality to me that you've got to understand that's why it's awkward, and there are some that are far more palatable. And I think for me it does come back to relationship, human-centered leadership, but just generally as a person, and trying to arrive at a collective agreed goal that you're going to focus your efforts on.
Dan, you have wonderfully brought us, I think, full circle back to human-centered, that element of high performance. Let me ask you a question, which I don't know whether you can answer or not. Just, I'd love your thoughts. Take into account the role that you have in the environment within which you work. How much time do you think you spend being the technical expert with all of your background and training? And how much time do you think you spend just being the people leader, the human-centered leader, where you're simply listening, connecting, empathizing, being inclusive? How much time do you think you spend in those two camps?
I think when I started in role, predominantly partly because of what was needed for the role, but also because of my background as a technical expert, I would have said it was 70% technical leadership and quite directive, maybe even 80, and 20% kind of human-centered. If I transpose that now to 6 years into my role, where, as I say, I've got an established leadership group, I've got a more established team and a coherent strategy, I would say I'm now probably 70% of my time is more in a human-centered, non-directive space of leadership, which is, sometimes highly uncomfortable for me to be in and very unfamiliar, and 30% in the more technical, problem-solving specific space. And again, along that way, I've burned myself. So being a good physiotherapist with a background in sport, I've been drawn into areas of technical leadership or even delivery within my group.
Right.
That has undermined and undervalued the people that I have doing that job, because I'm the leader kind of parachuting into this kind of space, which I don't think ultimately leads to very good outcomes, either at a player level or at a kind of team dynamic level. So I've had to learn that. And as I said earlier on in the piece, there is a thing about taking off the coat of being a technical expert, and you are now something completely different, and having to evolve accordingly.
And having to have the courage to do that as well, because that means people leaving behind them maybe the very thing that's allowed them to be successful.
Yeah, definitely. And it is, and I'm not saying it's comfortable for me now, because it's not. I still, obviously, every month you get all the journals that you could be reading from a technical perspective. And I'm always second guessing myself, should I be getting back up to date with this? And at the moment, I'm managing to fight that urge, but it's hard. It's really hard.
No, it is hard. Listen, Dan, how can people get in contact with you if they want to continue the conversation, learn a bit more from you? So how can they do that?
So yeah, really open to that. Would love to chat. So I guess best ways of getting hold of me, at Dan Lewindon from a Twitter perspective.
Yep.
danlewindon@me.com from an email perspective. But yeah, always open to have these sorts of conversations and learn a bit.
That's great. And I think you're on LinkedIn as well, aren't you?
Yes, beg your pardon. Yeah, that too.
No, it's great because I know a lot of listeners actually use that as a primary platform. Listen, final question, Dan. Is there a piece of leadership advice that you feel is the best piece of advice you've ever given or received? I know that's context-based, but is there something that's front of mind for you that you'd like to share?
Gosh, there's a few. I mean, I guess for me specifically, it would be something on the lines of take your time. Don't expect to have the answers because you don't need to have the answers. Be curious, and I think that's my kind of starter for 10.
No, I love that. And in a world that constantly changes, let's all be insatiably curious. I think that's great advice. Listen, Dan, you've been an absolute star. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Leadership Enigma. I hope you have enjoyed it too.
But it's been great. Thank you very much.
Join us again next week for more tips and strategies on the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with your host on LinkedIn or visit the dedicated website, www.leadersenigma.com, powered by Transform Performance International, where you can access our exclusive learning, including books, videos, bonus content, assessments, and more. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.